Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at an introduction to the Book of Ezekiel in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. We begin actually with the nation of Assyria. It was the big superpower, or had been the superpower, of the period just prior to Ezekiel's day. Now, what happened to this superpower is it had a number of enemies that ganged up against it. You have Nabopolassar, who was the king of Babylon. He was a Chaldean king. And then you had a neighbor to his, Cyaxares was king of the Medes to the north of Babylon. And each of those had their families unite. Nabopolassar had his son Nebuchadnezzar, who was the crown prince, was eventually going to take his place. Mary, the daughter of Cyaxares. So you had this wedding which brought together these two kingdoms, and with that alliance, now they set out to engage Assyria once and for all. And so in the year 612 BC, they converged upon the capital city of Nineveh. A group known as the Scythians, these wild horsemen that lived way up in the north, came down. They weren't really part of the alliance, but they just took the opportunity to do their thing as well. And as a result, in the year 612 BC, Nineveh was destroyed and the Assyrian power was broken. Following this, you have the remnants of what's left of the Assyrians flee to the west to a place called Karkamish, and they call in I guess you could call them their vassals, vassals slash friends down in Egypt, to come up and assist them against this final onslaught. Now, notice as the king of Egypt, and we're going to look at him in just a moment, his name is Necho II, as he is going to Karkamish, he has to pass through the kingdom of Judah, and specifically he's going to pass through a city that guards the pass through the mountains, the city of Megiddo. And so Necho II, Pharaoh Necho, he's headed up to Karkamish, but to get there, he has to go through this pass in the mountains at Megiddo. And he calls for Josiah, the king of Jerusalem, to let him pass unmolested. He claims that he's been sent by Yahweh. I don't know if he's making that up or if God had actually spoken to him or not. But for whatever reason, Josiah goes to meet him at Megiddo. Is it a battle? Is it just It's not going to end up being a friendly meeting, because Josiah is killed at that meeting, giving rise to the idea when nations come to Megiddo, there's trouble, there's judgment. And Josiah has been the last good king of the southern kingdom of Judah. His sons are going to come on the throne, one after the other, and none of them are going to follow the Lord the way Josiah did. And so we have Josiah. He's died. As soon as he dies, the people of Judah install his oldest son, Jehoahaz. Notice you've got a couple of variations of spelling for his name, but it's the same person. And he is installed as the king once his father dies. Now, Pharaoh Necho comes immediately down, does not let that stand, and deposes Jehoahaz and says, no, that's not going to work. I'm going to put somebody that I want in the throne, but the people actually want a son of Josiah. He's the royal family, although he's dead. And so Pharaoh Necho is going to take instead Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim will now be placed by Pharaoh Necho onto the throne of Judah. Now, following this, Pharaoh Necho is going to continue on his way up to Karkamish. That's where he was on his way before he got sidetracked at Megiddo. And at Karkamish, there is this battle to see who's going to be the ruler of the world. The Medes really aren't involved in this. They had headed back to their territory. And so you have, remember, it was Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, but he's getting on in years. And so he sends his son, Nebuchadnezzar, young crown prince Nebuchadnezzar, to lead the Babylonians against Pharaoh Necho. Yes, there are some Assyrians there, but they're not really part of the the battle that really matters. They are present, but they're not going to be the world rulers. That's already been decided. And in the battle, Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar wins, the Babylonians win, and Pharaoh Necho heads back to Egypt in defeat with Nebuchadnezzar hot on his track. And so Nebuchadnezzar now comes down on his way to Egypt, but he comes down to Judah. And remember, we left King Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim on the throne. We're going to have somebody else with a similar name in a minute. And Jehoiakim is, he comes under Nebuchadnezzar's thumb, and Nebuchadnezzar says, that's okay, you can continue to be king, but now I'm in charge, you're paying your taxes to Babylon, make sure that you do. Now, in that coming down to Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar takes some hostages in what I'm calling the first deportation. This is 605 BC, right after the Battle of Karkamish, and Nebuchadnezzar takes some sons of nobility. For example, Daniel and his three friends. This is recorded in Daniel chapters 1, and we see some of those friends mentioned in chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they are taken as hostages. Now, it's not hostages where they're in chains or anything like that. They're going to be royal hostages. They're going to be on their good behavior. They're going to be young men who are going to be trained in good Babylonian culture so that perhaps they can be used either in Judah or in Babylon for the running of the government. Now, meanwhile, we had Jehoiakim still on the throne, and so far that's good. He's been subjugated by Nebuchadnezzar. That was in the year 605 BC. But a few years later, he revolts and rebels. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes back to, and by this time, Nebuchadnezzar's father has died. And so he comes back. He's now King Nebuchadnezzar. He comes back against Judah, and he goes to capture Judah. He has Judah actually surrounded, and he's besieging the city. And in the meantime, Jehoiakim, who rebelled, dies, leaving his son Jehoiachin, also known as Jeconiah, also known as Coniah. I'm just going to refer to him as Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin now is the young king on the throne. His father has left him in rebellion, and Nebuchadnezzar captures the city and captures Jehoiachin and says, okay, I know you really didn't, you weren't leading this revolt, but you got caught up in it. And so you're going to be taken now also as a prisoner back to Babylon. And so now we've already seen the first deportation. Now we're seeing the second deportation. And there are 10,000 men of valor and craftsmen and smiths. They're all taken along with Jehoiachin. And also, this is what I've been leading up to. Also, Ezekiel will be taken into captivity. Now, this has all happened before the book of Ezekiel begins. So as the book of Ezekiel begins, Ezekiel himself, he is a priest and a prophet, and he's getting close to his 30th birthday, which means that he'll be officially able to be a priest, because you have to be so old to actually do the work of a priest, and he's been on the young side. And so his birthday comes along, but he's not in the land, and he's not around the temple, so he cannot be serving as a priest, even though he's supposed to be one. He's in far-off Babylon, not in the city itself, but in one of the suburbs, in one of the detention areas, as a captive in that land. Now, meanwhile, just to let you, I don't want to leave you hanging. So here's what takes place back in Jerusalem, and Ezekiel's going to be hearing news. He's going to be prophesying about it, and he's also going to hear it. Meanwhile, Zedekiah has been left. Jehoiachin was taken into captivity, and Zedekiah, the youngest son of Josiah, is left on the throne. Now placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar, saying, "Don't rebel. You stay there." And sure enough, he rebels, and it happens. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes back a third time. He's getting tired of coming back and forth. And so he comes back a third time, a third deportation, this time in 586 BC. Some textbooks say 587. I'm not going to quibble over the year. And this time, and Ezekiel's first going to prophesy, and then he's going to hear a report. In the middle of Ezekiel, we're going to actually get a report. The temple has been destroyed, Jerusalem has been destroyed, and the general population is being deported to Babylon. And so this is part of Ezekiel's prophecy, but it's also part of the world in which Ezekiel was living, and he's actually going to hear the news about which he has prophesied. Now, here's our timeline. So we just to get it all straight, we had Josiah, and then Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim. Notice that I'm speaking of the kings at the top, and Jehoiachin, and finally Zedekiah. So these were all the sons, and Jehoiachin was a grandson of Josiah. At the same time, meanwhile, in places like Judah, you've had prophets like Jeremiah, Obadiah, and Joel somewhere in there, perhaps. Joel, we're not sure. Habakkuk. Daniel is in Babylon. He's been prophesying, although we don't see, apparently they know about each other, but we don't see Ezekiel and Daniel meeting because they're actually in separate places in Mesopotamia. We had the fall of Nineveh, 612 BC, and now we have Ezekiel, and his ministry is beginning. He's already been around for a while, but his ministry is beginning during the days of Zedekiah, and then he's going to see that Babylonian captivity, and he will continue to prophesy even after that. Now let's look at the book itself. It can be divided, the book of Ezekiel, 48 chapters, divided into three major sections. The first section will be oracles against Judah, and it will begin with Ezekiel's call. He'll be called into ministry by God, and then he'll prophesy about judgment. He'll actually be acting out some of those things. He'll have a vision of the temple. He'll be there in Mesopotamia, but in the spirit, he'll be actually seeing things that are back in Jerusalem with the temple of God. And then there'll be another warning of judgment, and then he'll see these almost like living parables, pictures and symbols and things like that, and then more judgment. So you can see these oracles against Judah, there's lots of judgment, and then more pictures, judgment, pictures, judgment, pictures. It goes like that until we get to chapter 25. And chapter 25, instead of being against Judah, now there are oracles against the other nations. So they're not ignored. So you have nations around Judah, like Ammon and Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, those are Phoenician cities, and Egypt, and oracles against these various nations and or city-states. And that brings us to chapter 33, which are oracles of salvation, although it doesn't really begin so much with salvation. At first, in chapter 33, there's a vision of a watchman, and then a literal watchman shows up, somebody who comes from Judah with the announcement that the city has fallen. So, you actually have a prophecy, and then you see the news that Jerusalem has fallen. But then there is a promise. These are why these are oracles of salvation. Then you have a promise of restoration. In fact, Ezekiel has this vision of dry bones that sort of come. They're all dead. People that are not only dead, the flesh is gone. It's just bones, and the bones begin to come back together, and the flesh comes back on it. And this entire group of people come alive, and it's a picture of how the nation of Israel is going to come back to life, even though it's been destroyed as a nation. And then in chapters 38 and 39, there's this big battle vision of these places, Gog and Magog, that are coming down against Israel. Remember, Israel's already been destroyed, but in the vision, Israel's back in the land because they've been restored, and now these nations are coming against Israel, and God steps in and protects his nation, and those bad nations that are invading are destroyed, and God wins. And that brings us to chapter 40, which is a vision that Ezekiel has of a new temple. And it's chapters 40 through 48. This is the entire end of the book, which is a glorious vision of a new and rebuilt and glorious temple. So glorious, when we read about it, it's actually going to remind us of the glorious city that is described in Revelation chapters 21 and 22. And we'll look at those sections in parallel, and we'll see how closely they match up. That's the big idea of Ezekiel.